I can't believe no one else talks about Rosaria. It's been ages since I've talked about this character on the channel, but I've had her triple crowned on my free-to-play account for a little over a year now, and it's about time I talked about her again because a lot has changed. Put your thinking caps on and get your notebooks out because today is the day that I teach you everything you need to know to harness the power of one of the most underrated 4-stars in Genshin Impact. As always, this guide will cover her best artifacts and weapons to general playstyle and team compositions. Without further ado, let's get this guide rolling. Rosaria's elemental skill provides a consistent and situational benefit. Upon casting this skill, Rosaria will teleport to a nearby enemy to deal 2 hits of cryo damage. If the enemy is small, she will teleport behind them, but if the enemy is large, she cannot teleport behind them. With Rosaria's first Ascension talent, striking the backside of an enemy will grant Rosaria 12% crit rate for 5 seconds. Even if you can't teleport behind a large enemy, you can still get this buff by walking around the enemy and then hitting them from the backside with Rosaria's elemental skill. At face level, this buff is pretty good for Rosaria because it provides a consistent 12% crit rate buff to herself with only a 6-second cooldown on her elemental skill. Fortunately, the value of this buff only gets amplified when combined with her elemental burst. Rosaria's elemental burst plants a lance into the ground to pulse for cryo damage every 2 seconds, lasting 8 seconds at C0 with a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost. This ability is Rosaria's bread and butter, providing the bulk of her damage, cryo application, and other utility to her teammates. With her second Ascension talent, casting Rosaria's elemental burst will grant the entire party a crit rate buff that lasts for 10 seconds. The value given to teammates is equivalent to 15% of Rosaria's crit rate that appears on her stats page. With that said, there are a couple things to note when calculating your Rosaria's crit rate buff. Because the Cryo Resonance and the 4-set Blizzard Share effects will not appear on the character stat pages, these crit rate buffs will not be factored in. Additionally, this buff caps out at 15%, so you cannot build over 100% crit rate and expect a crit rate buff larger than 15%. What does factor into the crit rate buff is Rosaria's first Ascension talent that we talked about earlier. So it is recommended to use your elemental skill before casting your elemental burst for the maximum crit rate buff. It's only a 1.8% difference in the final crit rate buff, but it's a free buff regardless of your build, so definitely take advantage of it. All of Rosaria's constellations provide some situational benefit, but there's only one constellation that you need to pay attention to, and that's C2. C2 is by far Rosaria's best constellation in this day and age, providing a 4-second duration increase to her elemental burst. Since her elemental burst will tick for 4 times over the span of 8 seconds at C0, C2 turns that into 6 ticks over the span of 12 seconds. For Rosaria, who spends most of her time off-field nowadays, not only is that a huge DPS increase, but that's also some extra cryo application for her teammates. Overall, this is the constellation you definitely want to shoot for when it comes to pulling copies of Rosaria. C1 used to be okay back in version 1.4 where Rosaria was a popular physical DPS, but nowadays a buff to attack speed and normal attack damage is practically useless on Rosaria, who spends most of her time off-field. The same things can be said about C6, where physical red shred is an outdated buff for Rosaria herself. However, unlike C1, this buff can also be utilized by teammates, which turns it into a niche buff for certain teammates like Razor or Eula. Last but not least, C4 is Rosaria's other notable constellation outside of C2 and C5, which are direct buffs to Rosaria's elemental burst. C4 will grant 5 flat energy to Rosaria if her elemental skill lands a critical hit. C4 serves as a small quality of life constellation that can make up for 1 or 2 missing energy recharge rolls in artifact stats, which is always a nice benefit. Overall, C2 is the golden constellation for Rosaria, and anything after that can be seen as a small bonus. Moving into the theory crafting topics of today, let's start with energy generation. Rosaria's skill has a 6-second cooldown and is guaranteed to generate 3 cryo particles if you land the second hit of her elemental skill. This energy generation is one of the best in the game as long as you can use it more than once per rotation. With all things considered, even with Rosaria's fantastic energy generation, her energy requirements are extremely ambiguous. The recommended energy depends on her teammates, but I always like to err on the side of caution, so I always recommend at least 150 to 160% energy recharge on Rosaria. This value can definitely be as low as 130% with certain teammates, but for the most part I never have any problem sitting at around 160% energy recharge. As for Rosaria's internal cooldown, she has none. If energy generation wasn't a sign that Rosaria is an older character, her lack of ICD tells the rest of the story. This means that Rosaria is one of the best off-field cryo applicators who can apply cryo with every single pulse from her elemental burst. It's also good to note that both damage instances of the initial cast of her elemental burst and her elemental skill also share no ICD, so you can even set up some pretty cool double melts with some pyro application. This specifically is some neat stuff for a reverse melt team, but otherwise not as important as having no ICD on the pulses from her elemental burst. Given that Rosaria has decent damage on her elemental burst, good energy generation, and no ICD for her cryo application, that opens up 3 archetypes for Rosaria players to consider when building her: crit rate and energy support, freeze DPS, and reverse melt or general DPS. Each of these archetypes have their own best in slot artifact sets, but all 3 of the artifact sets that I'm about to list for each playstyle can be interchangeable if you'd like. The support Rosaria prefers the 4-set Noblesse Oblige, a freeze DPS Rosaria prefers the 4-set Blizzard Stare, and the reverse melt or general DPS Rosaria prefers the 4-set Emblem of Severed Fate. The 4-set Noblesse sacrifices a little bit of damage from a 4-set effect to provide a team-wide attack buff, meaning it can always be used on a freeze or melt DPS Rosaria as long as you're comfortable with sacrificing a little bit of personal damage for team utility. The 4-set Emblem of Severed Fate is Rosaria's best damage option if you're not using her in a freeze team. Although the 2-set Blizzard Share with the 2-set Noblesse combination can come close in damage at lower energy recharge values, the 4-set Emblem of Severed Fate becomes noticeably better once you get upwards of 160 to 180% energy recharge. The only artifact set that you cannot use as a flexible build option is the 4-set Blizzard Share. This artifact set is built for mono cryo and freeze teams only. With that being said, it is the best artifact set for the freeze playstyle, granting a whopping 40% extra crit rate against frozen enemies and an extra 20% crit rate for enemies only affected by cryo and are unable to be frozen. As for artifact stats, Rosaria likes the standard attack percent in the Sands, cryo damage bonus in the Goblet, and crit rate in the Circlet. Energy recharge in the Sands is viable for a supportive Rosaria, and elemental mastery in the Sands is viable for a reverse melt Rosaria, but for most players they aren't recommended because it's reliant on specific setup. Substat focus should be crit rate, crit damage, energy recharge, and attack percent, but EM can also be a focus if you build Rosaria for reverse melt. As I talked about earlier, Rosaria can use as little as 130% total energy recharge, but my recommended number is 150 to 160%. Unlike other characters, Rosaria has several outstanding 4-star weapons that are interchangeable no matter which role you've farmed your artifacts for, making her one of the easier 4-star characters to build. Your top 3 4-star options for Rosaria in no particular order are Favonius Lance, Wavebreaker's Fin, and the Catch. All 3 of these polearms can be used for any Rosaria playstyle, but Favonius Lance shines for support, Wavebreaker's Fin shines for freeze DPS, and the Catch shines for general DPS purposes. Favonius Lance has huge synergy with Rosaria's personal crit rate buff, and it only makes her stellar energy generation even better. The ability to funnel 3 clear energy particles and 3 cryo particles into another character or even Rosaria herself makes her one of the best energy batteries in the game. Combine this with a high base attack and a small ER stat, and Favonius Lance becomes one of the most well-rounded weapons for Rosaria. Wavebreaker's Fin specifically shines in a freeze team because the second cryo character paired with Rosaria allows you to forego some energy recharge and take full advantage of the extremely high base attack of this weapon. A lot of freeze characters like Kokomi, Xingqiu, Diona, Ayaka, etc. have very high energy costs to bolster the elemental burst damage bonus from the passive. But even in other teams, as long as you can consistently get Rosaria's burst up, Wavebreaker is a great option for damage. And of course, what's a polearm character without the Catch? This is by far your best fully free-to-play option on Rosaria, providing elemental burst damage and a respectable energy recharge stat. The only issue of the Catch is that many other polearm characters want this weapon, so if you already are using it on another character like Xiangling or Raiden Shogun, try to find another option for Rosaria. If you're looking for another weapon to use aside from the 3 staple options that I just discussed, there's not much else to mention. Of course, no matter which playstyle you decide to gear Rosaria towards, 5-star weapons like Staff of Homa, Engulfing Lightning, Primordial Jade Wing Spear, and Scoured Spine are all fantastic options for the raw stats that they give. However, I know a lot of you don't have these 5-star weapons, so as for 4-star weapons, the last two options I want to talk about are Deathmatch and Prototype Star Glitter. Deathmatch is a fantastic option, but because it's part of the $10 Battle Pass, it's not available to players who don't spend a dime on this game. Despite the low base attack, the huge crit rate stat makes this weapon worthwhile for low spenders due to how well it streamlines Rosaria's build. The reason I also want to mention Prototype Star Glitter is because it's your go-to free-to-play option for a support Rosaria if you don't have Favonius Lance and the catch is already being used by another one of your characters. Last but not least, we've arrived at the team section. By now, you should probably be familiar with how to build Rosaria for the different playstyles, but now it's time to build teams around Rosaria for each of the playstyles mentioned in this video. First, let's start off with Freeze, which is the most flexible team to build. Freeze consists of Rosaria, a Hydro Applicator, a Cryo character, and Kazuha to grant extra elemental damage bonus to the team. The Hydro slot is most often Kokomi to heal the team, provide consistent Hydro application, and buff the team with the 4-set Tenacity of the Millelith and the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's Catalyst. If you don't have Kokomi, Mona is a great substitute as she also has various ways to buff the team, which include her Elemental Burst or the 4-set Noblesse Oblige. As always, Xingqiu and Yelan are staple Hydro characters for lots of Hydro damage and Hydro application should you forego Kokomi and Mona. The second Cryo character can be Layla or Diona if you need survivability, but otherwise the team currently lacks damage, so it's more recommended to run a Cryo DPS in this slot and go for survivability in the Hydro slot. You can use a dedicated 5-star Cryo DPS like Ganyu or Ayaka, but if you don't have either of these characters, the team can become a quick swap team with the various Cryo support and sub DPS characters remaining. Kaya is a fantastic option and the most recommended character in this slot for raw damage with the 4-set Blizzard Share, but supports like C2 Chongyun for cooldown reduction or Shenhe for extra Cryo damage also function well in this slot for a second Cryo character. As if anyone wasn't expecting the last character, Kazuha is the go-to option for Freeze team since he's the only Anemo character to buff elemental damage instead of elemental mastery, which Freeze teams cannot utilize. You can substitute Kazuha for any other Anemo character with the 4-set Viridescent Veneerer like Jean, Sayu, or Sucrose, but just know that Kazuha is a huge factor in the success of Freeze teams. Next up, we have a Reverse Melt Rosaria. Contrasting with Freeze, this melt setup is very specific and only has a couple of substitutes for characters. The Reverse Melt team consists of Rosaria, Bennett, Xiangling, and a Flex slot. The Flex slot can be Kaya for extra Cryo melts and Cryo energy particles, Kazuha or Sucrose for buffing the melt reactions, or Zhongli for extra shielding and resistance shred. The idea of this team is to have Xiangling with Bennett to provide consistent pyro application for Rosaria's elemental burst to melt from. As I talked about in the theory crafting section, Rosaria has no internal cooldown, meaning she can melt every single instance of cryo damage she has given ample pyro application from the Xiangling and Bennett core. The Xiangling and Bennett core can also be replaced with the Jean and Bennett core, commonly dubbed as Sunfire. Pairing Jean and Bennett swirls Bennett's self-pyro application onto the enemy, which surprisingly provides enough pyro application for Rosaria just like Xiangling does. As for Rosaria support teams, there are two main archetypes that I want to talk about. The first one is an older archetype with Rosaria as a physical support for Eula. Rosaria makes for a fantastic Eula support for two reasons: her energy generation and her crit rate buff. Eula needs a ton of cryo energy, and aside from Diona with Sacrificial Bow, Rosaria is the next best cryo battery. The crit rate buff is also nice on Eula, but you do need to play your rotations pretty tight to have the buff active for Eula's entire DPS window, so energy generation is the main benefit of Rosaria, while the extra crit rate is a nice bonus if you play your cards correctly. The team consists of Rosaria, Eula, an off-field Electro DPS, and a Flex slot. The off-field Electro DPS is most often Fischl, Raiden Shogun, or Kuki Shinobu because they are not reliant on the Electro Resonance for energy. However, characters like Beidou, Yae Miko, Electro MC, Lisa, and Dori all work fine in this slot as long as your Flex slot picks another Electro character to complete the Electro Resonance. If you do not need the Electro Resonance, the best options for the last slot are 100% going to be Shielders. Layla and Diona provide extra Crow energy for Eula alongside Rosaria, but if you're looking for damage, Zhongli is going to be your best shielder. Last but not least, we have Rosaria in a Fridge team. For those who don't know what Fridge is, the extremely watered down one-sentence explanation goes something like this. Cryo and Dendro can exist on the enemy at the same time, meaning the Dendro aura will be preserved when Hydro also reacts with Cryo for freeze, resulting in more Bloom reactions overall. Like many other teams, Rosaria is so good for a Fridge setup due to how short her elemental skill cooldown is and how good her energy generation is per elemental skill use. A Rosaria Fridge team core consists of Rosaria, Hydro Applicator, and Dendro Applicator. The Hydro character can quite literally be any Hydro character that's not named Nilo, since this team does not adhere to Nilo's passive conditions for bountiful cores. Meanwhile, the Dendro character should be Nahida, Dendro MC, or Kale for off-field Dendro capabilities. The last slot should be either Kuki Shinobu for Hyperbloom or Toma for Burgeon. None of the characters mentioned beforehand should be building EM because creating Hyperbloom and Burgeon will calculate the damage from Kuki and Toma stats only. If you don't have Kuki or Toma, Dori can be a replacement for Hyperbloom, while Shinyan can be a replacement for Burgeon. With that, let me know your thoughts on Rosaria, whether it be questions about your builds, teams, or general opinions down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this guide or thought it was useful, be sure to support both the video and the channel. You can follow me on Twitch, Instagram, TikTok, or sub to the YouTube channel, whatever people do nowadays. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.